Okay, we're going to continue where we left off. Again, this chapter emphasizes how liberalism gets extended and balanced between rights for individuals, so specific individual members of society versus groups. You know, where do your group rights come from? Where do your individual rights come from? And how do we protect them? Everyone more or less should have a set of notes. I gave them out to everyone who was here like 2 or 3 days ago. Pretty sure we distributed this on Tuesday, so if you lost it in between now and then, that is a real tragedy. I'm not sure if I'll print off anymore, because I printed off about 35 copies. Okay. That's okay. It's not your fault. Okay, anyways, so this problem particularly, as it's already saying, the French, I don't know if it's specifying Quebec or France, but in France they really struggle with the personal expression. So in France, I think in 2006 they passed a law where they banned people from wearing religious symbols, right? So let's say in a liberal society like we live in, one that emphasizes rule of law and freedom of expression, you're allowed to, I mean, some of you are wearing a crucifix around your neck, right? If you're a Jewish person, maybe you wear, I forget the name of the hat. If you're a Sikh, in Canada, they had that issue, particularly Ontario. Anyone know what a kirpan is? K-I-R-P-A-N? It's a ceremonial dagger, right? So they had a student in Ontario, this part of his religious practices, he had to carry a ceremonial dagger. Okay, well, what's going to happen if you show up to school with what looks like a knife? Right? How do you think Mr. Heck or Mr. Rantucci is going to respond? Right? Not well. But if it's part of your religious expression, you have that right in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You know, how do you deal with that? The French, though, have, particularly in France, you know, they put that law out where people were not allowed to wear symbols that express their religion, particularly in schools. Okay, so let's say for those of you have how many of you are wearing a necklace of the crucifix right now? Okay, so you're wearing one, you're wearing one.
I have a scapular.
Okay, I don't know what that is. Okay, so for example, like you're wearing one, but I can't see it. Okay, now in our school we don't have a lot of, I don't actually think we have any Muslim women in the school, but a hijab is a religious symbol. And so if you say, hey, you can't wear a religious symbol that everyone else can see, who does it affect the most in that scenario? Is it going to affect someone like him who has his crucifix around his neck but under his shirt? Or is it going to affect, you know, a woman wearing a hijab? Thank you for, I don't know what that is, but okay. Do we understand what the word secular means? So there's religious and there's secular. Secular is where you leave religion out of the teaching. So in public schools, you're not allowed to talk about your religious beliefs and religious interpretations. Teachers could get in trouble for that. They'll more or less say that, hey, you're influencing children towards your religious belief. So you're not allowed to teach and preach religion in public schools, right? They're trying to be secular. They're trying to keep religion separate. That's what that means. Okay, and so yeah, so these the next couple of slides continue to expand on that topic, right? So again, I chat about this with my grade 9s. When governments put policies in place, it's always good to ask yourself the question, who does this affect the most? Right? So when minimum wage goes up, who's going to have the hardest time finding a job? People without some sort of skill, right? Some sort of experience. So if you're 14, 15, 16 years old and you're trying to find a job and minimum wage is $15 an hour, you're very expensive to hire. Okay? So if they put in a law that restricts your ability to wear or express a certain religious symbol, well, who's going to suffer the most in that case if you're looking at religious expression across the board? It's kind of sad. They don't teach world religions anymore in this school, or I think in the district. I believe they taught it a few years ago, so I don't even know what your knowledge is of other religions. Right? And I know Leduc has a smaller population, so it's not nearly as multicultural as, let's say, Edmonton or Calgary or Montreal. But, you know, obviously, as you can see, this girl is wearing a hijab. You know, let's say, I don't know, for whatever reason that other girl is circled, let's say she's Christian and she wears a crucifix. Well, she can easily hide her crucifix necklace so it's not publicly shown. But for the girl who's wearing the hijab, for her to not express her religion through her clothing, she would have to not wear the hijab, which then goes against her religion, right? So again, in a liberal society where people have the right to express their own religion, should a government be allowed to say, you can't wear some sort of cultural clothing because we want schools to be free of cultural influence, let's say, or religious influence, right? Anyways, this next line goes into how that expands onto people who wear turbans, who wear yarmulkes as well. I guess they did ban Christian crosses as well, although again, as I mentioned, that can be easily covered up. This slide just emphasizes, you know, again, other ways that governments try to rationalize their decisions. So, you know, should you be allowed to wear, let's say, a scarf or a head covering that is a religious expression on a piece of government ID? There was a community, I think it was the Mennonites in Alberta, or in Canada for sure. They made a charter right case against the government. So they don't believe, like, this particular group is very against technology. They don't necessarily believe in it. And when they started having photo ID from the government, they were telling people to go into some place, get your picture taken, have this physical ID. Okay, well, that broke their, you know, I guess their religion to some extent. It went against their rules. And so they argued against the government, saying, hey, you're actually infringing upon my right to freedom of expression, freedom of religion, right? So it's a similar issue. You know, should these people be allowed to, you know, like here where the woman is wearing a scarf and her face is quite covered, like, how do you know who that really is? So balancing out, how do you protect groups of people but also give individual rights, right? Like, you know, quite frankly, that could be anyone under there, right? You don't know. Additionally, so this woman's wearing glasses. I wear glasses as well. You know, should you be allowed to wear glasses? I don't know if you kids know who Russell Peters is. He's a comedian. He has quite the funny bit on catching terrorists by not making them smile. He's got a funny bit on that, but okay. But again, as these notes imply, part of a liberal society is having that freedom of expression and religion in particular. And so how do you protect the group? How do you protect the individual? How do you balance that, right? Which is essentially, group is collectivism and the individual is individualism. How do you protect both people's needs? How do you take care of the most people? And then, like your essay assignment, what is the role of the government? Like, what's the government's job in making sure that you are safe? Is it the government's job to make sure you are safe and protected? How should they do that? Like, how many of you would be okay with the government having access to your email account and your text messages in order to keep you safe? Right, some of you are shaking your head no. I don't really see anyone shaking their head yes. So does that mean those of you who are saying no or not saying yes, like, are you potentially admitting that you're guilty of some crime? Are you hiding something? That's an argument that's made. Well, if you have nothing to hide, why don't you want the government looking through your messages? Or your search history, for that matter, whatever it is, right? Whatever bothers you the most. Okay. So this slide just kind of extends how Quebec is attempted to do the same thing. Okay. So reasonable accommodation, do we have any idea what we think that means? What does it mean to accommodate someone? This is a term from grade 10. Like helping them, right? So let's say you're a Sikh, you're from India, you partake in the Sikh religion, you have to wear a turban. Okay? So the RCMP accommodates people who are Sikh by saying, hey, part of your uniform can be a turban. Maybe, and I believe they came out with a standard turban for their uniform, right? We accommodate that. You know, also in Canada, definitely in Ontario, you can ride a motorcycle and wear a turban. Like you can get an accommodation for that, right? So you don't need a helmet. I'm pretty sure I've seen it here once in Alberta, but I've seen it a couple of times in Ontario, right? So what does reasonable mean? Like when someone is being reasonable, what does that mean? How might you describe them if they're trying to make a trade with you and they're giving you a reasonable trade?
Good.
It's good, it's fair, right? Like if somebody gives you a bag of chips and they want $25, is that reasonable? No, right? But if they want $1, $2, it's reasonable, right? So reasonable accommodations is, okay, so for this person who is Sikh or for this girl who is Muslim, they have some sort of head covering. Should we allow them to wear it and work while they wear it? My sister, who worked as a nurse for a while, she wore a headscarf, and I remember it was a bit of they didn't really know what to do because they didn't know how to feel about the situation. But eventually, given the fact that they knew her, they gave her permission to wear one. They said, hey, we're okay with that. They did ask, though, that her face be fully visible and clear. Right? And so even with the headscarves within the Islamic religion, there's a lot of room for that.
Is that one of the reasons why the PQs lost?
I think the PQs lost for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
But that could be one of them. Yeah. Anyways, the proposal that the Parti Québécois suggested included some of these things. So, changing the Quebec Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. Alberta also has its own, by weakening the fundamental right to freedom of religion and strengthening the supremacy of the French language. So again, they're demonstrating that they clearly prefer the French group, okay, rather than your own religious group. Establish a duty of neutrality and reserve for all state personnel, including state-funded education, healthcare workers. So they're essentially saying, well, government workers should be neutral, right? Which would mean that let's say you migrated to Canada and you need to go to the immigration office, and let's say you're from a country where you were persecuted by Christians, like your life was under threat by Christians, and this government worker has a big cross necklace on their neck. Now you're not neutral, you're representing a symbol that in their past caused them harm, let's say. Okay, so a government worker shouldn't be wearing that. Limit the wearing of conspicuous religious symbols for said personnel. So conspicuous is kind of just like obvious stuff. It's just visible right there. Okay. Make it mandatory to have one's face uncovered when providing or receiving a state service. Again, with everything we've said, like that line very directly limits or discriminates against a particular group of people who have their face covered for a variety of reasons. The irony of that is, like, in 2020, everyone had to wear a mask and you had to cover your face. So the amount of robberies that went up because people would walk into a store wearing a mask with a hood and all you could see is this. In America, it's pretty bad. Like, people would just walk in with a mask and a hoodie on, clean house, and then how are you supposed to catch the person? You can't see anyone. Which, you can look at different layers of how to analyze that, right?
Yeah, you think the CAQs, now that they're back into power, you think they brought it back or something? The CAQs.
CAQ, what are those?
Well, it's shown up near Quebec though. That's the breakaway party of the PQs. Yeah, turn it off.
Well, I don't know. I don't know too much about French.
Never mind. It's again a controversy though.
Yeah, I'm not gonna go into that for now.
Yeah. We'd rather not.
Let me just see where we're at with the notes. We'll do a couple more slides, don't worry. We'll wrap this up soon. Okay, so now obviously there are times where you need to reject liberalism entirely. I would say that, you know, like you have to be very careful when you take away people's rights. If you were to take away another group's rights, what happens when people take away your rights? So we already looked at Hitler and his rise to power with Nazism. We looked at how Nazis restricted and removed the rights of Jewish people. We looked at how Stalin rejected the liberal idea of private property by, you know, what was the word they like to use in the textbook? Well, it's like redistributing property, right? So hey, rich peasant, the only way that you have gotten that wealth and that land is by oppressing other people. We're going to redistribute this. It's going to be public property for everyone's use, right? These are rejections of liberalism, many of the principles there. You have to be very careful when you do that, because if power starts amassing in one spot, you start centralizing it, you know, it's very hard for that group then to give up that power. Particularly, let's say, if the government gains control of the military and the press and whatnot, they then essentially control what is said about them by the press. If they have full control of the military, you know, it's very hard for citizens to, let's say, do something, right? That's why potentially the Second Amendment in America is very important to many Americans, right? The right to arm yourself. The origin of that Second Amendment is essentially from, you know, 200 years ago, where just in case the government got out of hand, you know, the citizens are allowed to have and own a weapon and essentially create a militia to protect themselves from an overreaching government, right? That's why many people feel that way, feel very strongly about that amendment, about that right of theirs to own a gun. And sure, you can say whatever about the modern adaptation, and obviously America spends so much money on its military that if they did go to war with their own citizens, yeah, those citizens wouldn't last a chance, right? It would be a bloodbath. But as you can see, there are two instances. So obviously there's some flooding going on in that right photo. Did anyone see the news? With the fires going on, the Alberta government did declare a state of emergency, and they asked for extra help from the federal government. I don't know the full details of what became of that, but when a country or a city declares a state of emergency, as this slide is talking about, you know, that is where governments might decide it's reasonable to restrict certain rights. So during the COVID pandemic, the government claimed that it was reasonable to restrict your freedom of movement. Hey, to stop the spread, to, what do they call it, flatten the curve that went on for 2 years, 3 maybe, to flatten the curve, we're gonna tell you to stay home. You're not allowed to leave your house. Now in Alberta, we were still very liberal. We were still open about that rule. We didn't go full authoritarian in Alberta. In Quebec, I have a number of friends who mentioned that they had curfew for several months, maybe a year. Meaning after 8 p.m., if you were out of your house, the police would question what you're up to. They saw you, and they could potentially give you a fine, right? So again, in a state of emergency, whether that be some sort of natural disaster, I don't really know the origins of the grass fires. I don't know if there's any human influence in that, but like as in direct influence, like somebody starting the fire. But when there's a state of emergency, you know, potentially that is when people are more okay with the government amassing power, making decisions for them. So we have a little political cartoon here. They're at the US border. By the entrance we see, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. I have no idea what that means. Send these, the homeless, tempest tossed to me, I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I can't help but think we're sending a mixed message. So, presumably that's the Statue of Liberty, liberty meaning freedom. There's a quote here that's essentially more or less saying like, hey, send your troubled people over to me. But then look at the border crossing itself. There's barbed wire, there's a stop sign, there's armed guards. There's one door for an entrance. And there's this mixed message here. I'm not going to keep hammering on this slide, we'll just move on. The War Measures Act is a very interesting piece of legislation, very interesting document. It has not been used often in Canadian history. Although an extension of it or a variation of it was applied, not the War Measures Act itself, was applied during the COVID pandemic again. Justin Trudeau utilized his capacity as government. They went in, they froze the bank accounts of people who were protesting in Ottawa. And they took a very extreme response to the protests, and it's not really being aired on CBC, I don't think, but there are trials going on right now and political judgments being made on whether or not the government was right to use that act to implement that level of government intervention. And again, this all comes back down to, what is the role of government in society? Like, what is the government's job? What should they do when there's a global pandemic? What should the government do when there's fires and multiple cities need to be evacuated? What would you like the government to do as well? Some of us think, well, the government should step in and solve all of our problems. Some of us think, well, the government should stay out of it, we'll organize ourselves, we'll figure something out. These responses can vary. It also relates a lot to how competent people are, right? How capable they are. So I really don't know. I really don't know or don't see how many people who would be willing to help volunteer as firefighters nowadays. To say, hey, there's grass fires going around the province. Like, I'm a young, healthy individual. I'll volunteer. I'll offer my services to help fight these fires. Anyways, the War Measures Act comes in place when the government needs to take control and make some decisions, potentially tell people, restrict their right and freedom of movement, amongst a variety of things. But anyways, some of the reasons given to justify the act's use: it was necessary for the overall good of society, it was justified because of the threat or severe nature of the situation, it was essential to protect, retain, and secure other principles of liberalism. I believe the War Measures Act, two of the times I recall, one was during one of the world wars. I believe the second time was the Oka crisis. I don't know if you recall what that is. Anyone? That's kind of more grade 11. The Oka crisis was when this private company was trying to build a golf course on indigenous land, and the indigenous people were resisting. They set up a blockade. Some police officer got shot and killed, I think. They called the military. I believe that was one of the times they used the War Measures Act. And so this next step is important. The act allows the cabinet, that's the government, the cabinet, again, the cabinet is, they are chosen by the prime minister, if I understand or recall correctly. So the cabinet is allowed to govern by decree, meaning just pure decision making, like, hey, we're gonna do this, rather than through discussion and debate. So instead of saying, hey, there's fires all around Alberta, what do you think we should do? And we take turns hearing what everyone should do. Instead, the War Measures Act allows the government to simply say, there's fires in Alberta, here's what's gonna happen. People are gonna evacuate these regions, no one is allowed to go here, they have to go here. We're gonna send in troops to assist with this process, we're gonna send in extra reserve firefighters, so on and so forth. And the trouble with that is that once you give the government that kind of power, it can become very difficult for the government to return that power. So in Western democracies like North America, in Europe, it might be easier because we have an expectation that the government's going to get the power back. But in other parts of the world, in more developing countries, sometimes when the military steps in to take power, or that would be kind of like a coup, or a particular president or prime minister steps in and says, I'm going to use the military to enforce this stuff, it can go very wrong very quickly, and it can go wrong for a long time. Let me just see what's going on with the slides here. We'll go over the World War slides and we'll call it a day. Okay, so it's a couple more slides here.
So during the Oka crisis, though, you think the indigenous were victorious after that?
I can't recall what the outcome of that was. Like, so they didn't build the golf course, so in that way, sure, they're victorious. I think the argument could be made that coming together of the indigenous community helped them to potentially kickstart and launch a lot of other movements. Like Idle No More happened in the early 2000s, or kind of 2005 to 2010, 12, which is a big movement as well. A couple other things that are escaping my mind right now. Okay. So this detaining and what is the proper word? Like, these aren't concentration camps. So in Canada's history, we put under, what is the word? We did internment camps, that's the word. We put a variety of different groups into internment camps. In World War I, the enemy aliens were from Germany, Austria-Hungary, parts of Ukraine. So anyone who was a Canadian citizen but had that some sort of ancestry, their loyalty to Canada was under question, and the safety of Canadians was under question. And so what does the government do? They say, okay, we're going to intern you, we're going to gather you up, put you in camps. It's easier to watch you and monitor you. It's easier to make sure you're not engaging in illegal activities and you're not actively working against Canada. They're allowed to do that through government policy, right? So again, that's a rejection of liberalism at that point, right? So under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, under your legal rights, you are innocent until proven guilty. So let's say, for those of you who are from England, let's say, your family background, or sure, there's a bunch of Filipinos here. Let's say the Philippines goes to war against some country that Canada supports. Should all Filipino Canadians then be presumed guilty and be put into a camp, like taken from your house, all your possessions taken from you, you're essentially put to work by the government, right? That's rejecting liberalism, this idea that you're innocent until proven guilty, right? That you're equal in front of the eyes of the law. Okay, some of the things that were done to the Austria-Hungary and the enemy aliens. So you have registration with the government. Okay. They're not permitted to leave the country without exit permits, so their movement is being restricted. They're being tracked as well. They're not allowed to own a gun, join any group the government deemed inappropriate or dangerous. So they're heavily restricting their activity. Okay. And so this was 1914 to 1920, so this is just a little bit over 100 years ago, which really isn't that long. How many of you have a grandparent that's like 80 years old, 80 or older? A couple of us, anyone 70 or older? So, their lifetime, a little bit more than their lifetime. So it's not that long ago that we simply decided as a country, hey, because we're at war with your people, despite the fact that maybe you've been living in Canada for 5 to 25 years, we're gonna put you into an internment camp, we're gonna keep you under watch, we're gonna register you, we're gonna control your behavior because we don't trust you. We're just gonna assume you're guilty and monitor you and make sure that you don't do anything dangerous. Okay. think everyone's done with the slide. So skipping over to World War II, you have Japanese internment. I'm sure there was some involvement of Germans as well, but maybe they learned their lesson by that time. Anyways, because Japan, has essentially direct sea access from Japan to BC, or coast of Canada, they are now public enemy number one and need to be monitored and watched and supervised. And so, as I say, about 23,000 Japanese Canadians were placed in camps. I don't know the full number. And so this notice all Japanese persons and persons of Japanese racial origin. That's interesting because the second part says that, hey, even though, let's say you were born in Canada, your parents were born in Canada, your grandparents were the ones that came over from Japan, because you have some sort of Japanese racial connection, you're still potentially guilty, right? We need to watch you. And so here's a variety of cities, and at the bottom it says that any person of the Japanese race found within any of the said prohibited areas without a written permit from the British RCMP area, they are liable to the penalties provided under order in council, right? So, even during the COVID lockdowns and when they had vaccine passports, it was just a reiteration of things that our government's done plenty of times that governments have a tendency to do, particularly when they're scared, when they don't know all the answers, and potentially don't want to lose power. So they kind of grab at power and try to control what people are doing, right? And so they control the Japanese, they control the other groups that we just chatted about as well. And for many Japanese Canadians, I think, like in most cases, I think it was a lot worse for those people in America, Japanese Americans. A lot of them lost everything that they had worked for, everything that their families had generated over the last 10, 20, 30 years, because while they were interned in camps elsewhere, people were just allowed to, break into their houses, take their property, destroy their businesses. That happened to a lot of people. And here's this photo. It says, "Japs keep moving." This is a white man's neighborhood. I honestly can't tell if that's a guy or a girl, which if it's a woman, that'd be ironic. So interestingly enough, just reading through these slides and reflecting on this information, a lot of this is quite similar to what the Nazis did to Jewish peoples, saved from incinerating them, which is a horrible thing to do, and the, let's say also additionally the level to which the Nazis did it. But initially during World War I, we saw, well, they have to get registered. And the first thing that happened to Jewish people was that they got tattooed on their arm. They got given a number. Right? They removed their humanity from them. Right? They removed their human dignity from them as well. The Nazis also separated men and women and children as well. In this case, the Japanese women were not incinerated on the spot in the Nazi concentration camps. Many women and children, as soon as they were separated, as soon as they took all their valuable stuff, they stripped them naked and just killed them. Right? They just incinerated them in like gas showers and killed them. Right? So, we're seeing some similarities. We're just not seeing the same extent. It's not as bad, right? But the essence of what they're doing is still wrong, right? Like they're essentially just saying Japanese people are guilty just because Japan is at war with our part of the world. And it doesn't matter if your grandma came from Japan, like you're guilty now. Okay, and deportation is always an offer given to these people who the government decides that they're against. And did anyone here migrate to Canada when they were very young, like less than 5 years old? Anyone? Couple?
Where are you from? You're Texan?
Yeah.
For most of you, like when did you come to Canada? Like how old are you?
I think I was like 5 or 6.
Okay, so you're right around that cusp. Anyone like 6 to 8?
Dress.
8 to 10? So you came here after you're 10 years old. Okay, so you still remember what it's like to be back home in the Philippines. Okay, so what would you rather prefer, like living here in the Philippines? Here, okay, right? Which is interesting. So I came to Canada when I was 2 years old. And if for whatever reason the government decided, well, you were born in Pakistan, we're gonna deport you. I don't know why they do that. It would be terrible. Like I really know nothing about my home culture. I'm not really connected to it, right? So imagine you had grown up in Canada, your parents had grown up in Canada, you were raised like this, but because you look a little bit different and your family's from somewhere else, you know, all of a sudden in conflict, the government just says to you, like, you can get deported, you can go to your home, or you can go to where we tell you, right? And maybe you don't want to go to the east of the Rockies, potentially, you know, do hard labor and lose all your valuable stuff, everything you've worked for and built up. So it really is a terrible thing to offer people. And then, you know, fortunately the government did address the wrong that they did, and seems like they paid out individuals who were directly impacted by that. Which more or less would be, I guess you could consider as reparations to an extent. Okay, we will wrap up with that. Thank you very much.